The strongest people in a room are often the ones nobody bothers to see. The lunch crowd inside Harper's Grill moved with the familiar rhythm of small-town America, where coffee cups were never empty for long and conversations floated comfortably between football scores, weekend plans, and family stories. The smell of grilled burgers, fresh fries, and homemade pie filled the air while sunlight poured through the large front windows, warming the polished wooden tables. At a quiet booth near the back sat James Carter, a 62-year-old Black Army veteran whose calm presence blended naturally into the restaurant despite the distinguished military cap folded neatly beside his plate. He had arrived shortly after noon, ordered the daily special, thanked the waitress with a warm smile, and spent the last several minutes reading a handwritten birthday card from his granddaughter. Every few moments he looked toward the window with the peaceful expression of someone who had learned that silence could be a gift after a lifetime of service. Across the restaurant, families laughed together, a young couple shared a basket of fries, and two retired mechanics debated whether an old pickup truck could ever truly wear out. Nothing suggested that the ordinary afternoon would soon become unforgettable. The front door opened with a familiar chime, and Officer Daniel Brooks stepped inside, wearing a crisp police uniform that immediately drew respectful glances from several customers. He acknowledged a few regulars with brief nods before his attention settled on James. For reasons that even Daniel himself could not fully explain, he stopped walking. His expression tightened. He studied James from across the dining room as though the quiet veteran had somehow disrupted the comfortable order of the room simply by existing there. Without speaking to anyone else, Daniel walked directly toward the booth. Conversations gradually softened as nearby customers noticed the officer's unusually focused approach. The waitress who had served James moments earlier slowed her pace, sensing an uncomfortable shift in the atmosphere. Daniel stopped beside the table and looked down with an expression of firm authority. "Sir," he said evenly, "I'm going to need you to come with me for a moment." James slowly folded the birthday card, placed it inside his jacket pocket, and looked up with calm eyes that carried decades of experience. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked politely. Daniel did not answer the question. Instead, he glanced around the dining room before saying, "Several people are uncomfortable. I think it's best if you leave." A quiet ripple spread through the restaurant. A man at the counter lowered his coffee mug without taking a sip. A mother gently placed her hand on her son's shoulder. The waitress blinked in confusion because no customer had complained to her. James remained seated, his voice measured and respectful. "I've been here for 20 minutes. I ordered lunch, paid for my meal, and have done nothing but enjoy my afternoon." Daniel folded his arms. "I'm asking you to leave." James looked around the room, meeting the eyes of strangers who suddenly seemed uncertain where to look. He saw sympathy on a few faces, discomfort on others, and silence almost everywhere. He reached for his wallet slowly, not because he intended to argue, but because dignity had taught him that composure often spoke louder than emotion. The restaurant felt smaller with every passing second. Forks rested quietly against plates. The television above the counter continued showing a baseball game that no one was watching anymore. Outside, traffic rolled peacefully past the windows, completely unaware that inside Harper's Grill, one quiet decision was about to reveal far more about the people witnessing it than the man being asked to leave. James Carter rose from the booth with the same measured composure that had carried him through years of military service. He did not rush. He did not argue. He simply reached for the receipt lying beside his plate, folded it carefully, and slipped it into his wallet before looking back at Officer Daniel Brooks with quiet respect. "Officer," he said gently, "if I have done something wrong, I would appreciate knowing what it is." Daniel kept his expression firm. "I have already explained that it would be better if you left." James glanced briefly toward the untouched half of his lunch before returning his attention to the officer. "I paid for my meal. I have spoken politely to everyone here. I am only asking for the reason." Daniel shifted his weight, but offered no specific explanation. Instead, he repeated the request in a steady voice that echoed farther through the suddenly silent restaurant than he intended. "Sir, it is time to go." The words settled over every table. Forks remained suspended above plates. A waitress carrying a fresh pot of coffee stopped halfway across the dining room, uncertain whether to continue serving customers or watch what happened next. Near the entrance, A father quietly whispered to his young daughter that they should stay seated. The little girl looked toward James with innocent curiosity, unable to understand why the kind man who had smiled at her a few minutes earlier was now being asked to leave. Sarah Collins, the restaurant manager, stepped out from behind the front counter after hearing the unusual silence. She quickly looked from James to Officer Brooks, searching for some obvious problem that justified interrupting a peaceful afternoon. Finding none, she approached cautiously. "Officer, is everything all right?" she asked. Daniel answered without looking at her. "This is a police matter." Sarah hesitated. She knew every employee on duty had spoken warmly about the polite gentleman in the back booth. She also knew no customer had reported any disturbance. Still, the presence of a uniform carried weight, and uncertainty held her in place. James noticed her discomfort and offered a reassuring smile. "You have treated me with kindness," he said. "Thank you for that." He gathered his folded veteran's cap from the table with slow, deliberate care, brushed away a few invisible crumbs, and placed it gently on his head. The simple gesture carried quiet dignity that many people in the restaurant immediately recognized. A retired couple near the window exchanged concerned glances. One elderly man narrowed his eyes as though trying to remember where he had seen that style of military cap before. Across the room, a young server quietly reached into her apron and lowered her cellular telephone beneath the counter, uncertain whether she should begin recording. Daniel motioned politely toward the entrance. James nodded once, refusing to allow bitterness to replace his calm. Together, they began walking toward the front door. Every step seemed slower than the last. Conversations had completely disappeared now, replaced only by the soft hum of the ceiling fans and the distant sound of traffic outside. Customers followed the quiet procession with their eyes. Some appeared uncomfortable. Others seemed confused. A few looked disappointed. No one spoke. Yet as James reached the middle of the dining room, something almost impossible to notice began changing. Faces that had remained turned toward their meals were now turned toward him. People who had planned only to finish lunch suddenly found themselves questioning what they had just witnessed. The silence inside Harper's grill no longer felt empty. It felt as though an entire room was waiting for someone to decide whether remaining quiet was easier than doing what was right. James reached the front door just as the afternoon sunlight spilled across the entrance, but before he stepped outside, he paused and turned slightly toward Sarah Collins. His voice remained calm, carrying none of the frustration that many people expected after what had just happened. "Thank you for your kindness," he said. "You have always treated me with respect." Sarah lowered her eyes for a moment, clearly troubled by everything unfolding in front of her. "I am sorry," she replied softly. "I truly am." James answered with a gentle nod before pushing the door open. Officer Daniel Brooks followed a few steps behind, convinced that the situation was finished. Outside, a light breeze moved through the parking lot as cars rolled past the restaurant without slowing. James stood quietly near the sidewalk, adjusted the veteran's cap resting on his head, and looked back toward the restaurant windows where dozens of faces remained fixed on him. He did not appear angry. He looked disappointed, but there was also remarkable peace in his expression, the kind that comes only after years of carrying burdens most people never see. Daniel folded his arms and spoke in a controlled tone. "I hope there will not be any more problems today." James looked directly at him. "Officer, may I ask you one last question?" Daniel gave a brief nod. "Go ahead." James smiled politely. If another man had been sitting at that table, wearing the same clothes, ordering the same lunch, speaking with the same respect, would you have asked him to leave? Daniel hesitated for only a fraction of a second before answering. "That is not the issue." James quietly accepted the response without arguing. Instead, he reached inside his jacket and removed a small leather wallet that looked worn from decades of careful use. He opened it slowly and withdrew a neatly protected identification card along with a folded photograph. He handed the photograph to Daniel first. It showed a much younger James standing beside fellow soldiers, all smiling despite dusty uniforms and exhausted faces. Behind them flew an American flag raised over a temporary base. Daniel studied the image without speaking. James then showed the identification card. "I served this country for 28 years, he said calmly. "I retired with gratitude for every opportunity one was given to protect people I would never meet." There was no pride in his voice, only quiet honesty. The uniform I wore came off years ago, but the values it taught me never did. Daniel glanced at the identification before returning it. His expression barely changed. "Thank you for your service," he said automatically, the familiar words sounding more like routine than reflection. "But my decision stands." James accepted the card and carefully placed both items back into his wallet. "I understand," he replied. "Respect cannot be demanded. It has to be chosen." Inside the restaurant, several customers had moved closer to the windows. A retired Marine recognized the military insignia on James's cap and slowly removed his own baseball cap in silent respect. A young woman who had quietly recorded part of the encounter lowered her telephone and whispered, "He served our country." Her words spread from one table to another like a gentle ripple across still water. The atmosphere inside Harper's Grill changed almost imperceptibly. People were no longer watching a disagreement between an officer and a customer. They were witnessing a man whose dignity remained untouched even after being publicly dismissed. Without planning it together, without speaking to one another, several diners began pushing back their chairs at nearly the same moment, as though the silence that had filled the restaurant was finally preparing to give way to something far more powerful than words. The first chair scraped softly across the wooden floor. It was such a small sound that most people would have ignored it on any other afternoon. Yet inside Harper's Grill, it seemed louder than every conversation that had filled the room only minutes before. An elderly man wearing a faded jacket with a small military pin slowly stood from his table near the window. He looked toward James Carter, removed his cap, and placed it respectfully against his chest without saying a single word. James noticed the gesture and answered with a quiet nod that carried more gratitude than any speech could have expressed. Before anyone had time to process what was happening, another chair moved. A middle-aged woman who had been eating lunch with her teenage son rose to her feet. She walked toward the front counter, paid for the meal she had barely touched, then calmly stepped outside to stand several feet behind James. She did not speak to the cameras beginning to appear. She did not look at Officer Daniel Brooks. She simply chose where she wanted to stand. Inside the restaurant, the young waitress who had served James wiped away tears she had not realized were forming. Sarah Collins looked across the dining room and saw something remarkable unfolding before her eyes. Customers were no longer looking down at their plates. They were looking at one another, silently asking the same question without speaking. What kind of community did they want to be? A retired school principal quietly folded his newspaper and stood. A delivery driver collecting a late lunch placed a few bills on the table before walking toward the exit. Two construction workers wearing reflective safety shirts exchanged brief glances, nodded together, and followed. One by one, people left their comfortable seats, not in anger, not in protest filled with shouting, but with quiet purpose. Outside, James remained exactly where he was. He had never asked anyone to defend him. He had never raised his voice or demanded attention. Yet the growing line of ordinary Americans standing nearby became impossible to ignore. Daniel looked from one face to another with increasing uncertainty. He had expected the afternoon to end the moment James walked outside. Instead, every passing second seemed to bring another person through the restaurant doors. Some stood with folded arms. Others simply placed their hands in their pockets. A young father lifted his little daughter into his arms so she could see over the parked cars. She whispered, "Why are they standing here?" Her father answered quietly, "Because sometimes respect needs company." Those simple words lingered in the afternoon air. Sarah finally stepped outside as well, locking eyes with James before taking her place near the entrance. She was still the restaurant manager, still responsible for serving customers. Yet in that moment, she understood that hospitality meant more than serving meals. It meant recognizing the dignity of every guest who walked through the front door. Drivers passing along the street slowed as they noticed the unusual gathering. A few pedestrians paused to ask what had happened. Several customers quietly explained the situation without exaggeration or hostility. The story spread naturally from one conversation to the next. Daniel remained standing near the sidewalk, still wearing the same badge, the same uniform, and the same expression of authority. Yet for the first time that afternoon, he realized authority alone could not control what people chose to believe. Around him stood mechanics, teachers, veterans, nurses, parents, students, and retirees. They had arrived separately, lived different lives, and held different opinions about countless subjects. Yet at that moment, they shared one simple conviction. They believed that every person deserved to be treated with equal respect and without speaking a single organized slogan. They had transformed one man's lonely walk out of a restaurant into a quiet reminder that courage sometimes begins with nothing more than the decision to stand beside someone who should never have been standing alone. Officer Daniel Brooks had spent years believing that authority naturally inspired confidence. Yet as he looked around the parking lot, he saw something he had never experienced before. No one was raising a voice. No one was making dramatic gestures. Instead, ordinary people simply remained beside James Carter with quiet determination, and somehow that silent unity carried more weight than any argument ever could. Daniel instinctively reached toward the radio attached to his shoulder, then stopped. There was no emergency to report. There was no disturbance to control. There was only an unexpected gathering of citizens who had decided they would not walk away from what they had witnessed. A young man who had quietly recorded part of the encounter uploaded the video from his cellular telephone while standing near the sidewalk. Within minutes, messages began appearing on his screen as friends shared the recording with others across town. Inside Harper's Grill, Sarah Collins watched through the front window as more customers chose to leave their unfinished meals behind and step outside. She turned toward the remaining diners and said softly, "Anyone who wishes to finish lunch is welcome to stay, but everyone deserves to be treated with dignity when they come through our doors." Several employees exchanged grateful smiles, relieved that someone had finally spoken aloud what they had all been feeling. James remained exactly where he had been from the beginning. He neither encouraged the growing crowd nor tried to stop them. He simply stood with calm patience, occasionally thanking people who quietly introduced themselves or shook his hand. One elderly woman smiled warmly and said, "My husband served for 30 years. I know the character that kind of life builds." James answered with his familiar humility, "Thank you, ma'am. I only tried to do my duty." Across the parking lot, passing drivers slowed after noticing the unusual scene. Some recognized friends among the crowd and parked to ask what had happened. The explanation spread from person to person without exaggeration. By the time another police vehicle entered the shopping center, dozens of people already understood why so many neighbors had chosen to stand together. Captain Robert Hayes stepped out of the patrol vehicle with the calm confidence of someone who had spent decades resolving difficult situations. He greeted Daniel first with a brief nod before quietly observing the crowd, the restaurant, and James standing peacefully near the entrance. Nothing about the scene suggested disorder. The only unusual element was the unmistakable atmosphere of disappointment hanging over everyone present. Captain Hayes approached Sarah Collins and politely asked what had happened. She described the entire encounter carefully, making certain to repeat only what she had personally witnessed. He then spoke with several customers, whose accounts remained remarkably consistent despite coming from different backgrounds and different tables inside the restaurant. Finally, Captain Hayes walked toward James. "Sir," he said respectfully, extending his hand, "my name is Robert Hayes. I understand you have had a difficult afternoon." James accepted the handshake with a gentle smile. "Captain, I appreciate you taking the time to listen." Hayes noticed the veteran's cap, the weathered wallet still resting in James's hand, and the calm dignity that had remained unshaken throughout the entire experience. He then turned toward Daniel with a thoughtful expression rather than an angry one. "Officer Brooks," he said evenly, "before we go any further, I would like to understand exactly what led to this decision." For the first time since entering the restaurant, Daniel realized that the question he had expected everyone else to accept without hesitation was now being asked of him instead, and the answer suddenly felt far more difficult to give than he had imagined only a few minutes earlier. Daniel Brooks drew a slow breath before answering Captain Robert Hayes, but the confidence that had carried him into the restaurant only a short time earlier seemed to fade beneath the quiet attention of everyone standing nearby. He searched for words that would explain his decision, yet every sentence sounded less convincing once spoken aloud. "I believed it was the best way to prevent a problem," he finally said. Captain Hayes remained calm. "What specific problem did Mr. Carter create?" Daniel looked briefly toward the restaurant entrance, then back at James. There were concerns. Hayes asked another simple question. "Who expressed those concerns?" Silence followed. Daniel realized he could not identify a single customer who had complained. Sarah Collins spoke carefully, making certain her voice remained respectful. "Captain, none of my employees reported any disturbance, and no customer approached me with a complaint before Officer Brooks spoke with Mr. Carter." Hayes thanked her with a nod and turned towards several people gathered nearby. One after another, customers described what they had personally witnessed. Their stories differed only in small details, but every account shared the same central truth. James had quietly entered the restaurant, greeted the staff politely, ordered lunch, thanked the waitress, and remained peacefully at his table until he was asked to leave. Hayes listened without interruption. He never hurried anyone. He simply allowed every voice to be heard. When the final customer finished speaking, the captain walked toward James once more. "Mr. Carter," he said, "is there anything you would like to add?" James smiled gently. "Only this, Captain. I spent many years believing that the uniform I wore represented the best of our country. I still believe that. That is why I hope today becomes a lesson rather than another reason for people to lose faith in one another." The words settled over the gathering with remarkable weight. No accusation, no bitterness, only hope. Hayes lowered his eyes for a brief moment before looking back at Daniel. "Officer Brooks," he said quietly, "our responsibility has never been simply to enforce rules. Our responsibility is to earn the trust of every member of the community we serve." Daniel remained silent. For the first time that afternoon, he saw himself through the eyes of the people standing around him. He saw parents comforting children who had watched the encounter. He saw veterans who understood the meaning of service. He saw neighbors who had gathered not because they wanted conflict, but because they believed fairness mattered. The realization arrived slowly, but it arrived nonetheless. Hayes continued speaking in the same steady tone. "Based on what I have learned today, I will be documenting this incident and relieving you from active duty pending a formal review. Please return to the station with me after we finish here." There was no anger in his voice, only accountability. Daniel nodded quietly. He understood that arguing would accomplish nothing. The crowd remained completely silent. No one celebrated. No one applauded. The absence of triumph made the moment even more powerful. James stepped forward slightly and looked at Daniel with calm compassion. "Officer," he said, "I truly hope this day becomes the beginning of something better for both of us." Daniel met his eyes for the first time without defensiveness. He saw neither resentment nor satisfaction there. He saw only sincerity. Around them, the afternoon sun continued shining across the parking lot as though the world itself had never changed. Yet everyone standing outside Harper's grill understood that something important had shifted. Justice had not arrived through anger. It had begun with ordinary people choosing courage over silence, and with one man who refused to let another person's prejudice take away his dignity. Captain Robert Hayes thanked the gathered citizens for remaining calm before inviting everyone to give the officers a little space. The crowd responded immediately, stepping back without complaint because they understood that respect worked both ways. James Carter quietly thanked the people standing beside him, shaking hands with several veterans, smiling at the young waitress who had first shown him kindness, and nodding warmly toward Sarah Collins. The tension that had filled the parking lot slowly gave way to thoughtful silence. Daniel Brooks stood only a few feet away, listening as conversations unfolded around him. For the first time in many years, people were not discussing his badge or his authority. They were discussing character. One elderly veteran looked toward James and said, "Service does not end when the uniform comes off." Another quietly answered, "Neither does dignity." Those simple words settled deeply into Daniel's thoughts. Captain Hayes approached him again, speaking in a voice meant only for the two of them. "Daniel, every officer makes difficult decisions. The question is whether those decisions are based on facts or assumptions. Today, too many people saw assumptions." Daniel lowered his eyes. "I understand, Captain." Hayes nodded slowly. "Understanding is the first step. Learning is the next." Nearby, a local television reporter arrived after receiving several calls from witnesses. She observed the peaceful gathering before politely asking if anyone would be willing to explain what had happened. Several people pointed toward James, but he gently declined the invitation. "The story should never be about me," he said with his familiar humility. "It should be about treating every person with fairness before making a judgment." The reporter paused, surprised by the quiet wisdom in his response, then asked whether he wished to file a public complaint. James smiled kindly. I want accountability where it is needed, but more than that, I want understanding. If one difficult day helps prevent another family from experiencing the same thing, then something good can still come from this. His words spread quickly among those standing nearby. Several people quietly repeated them to others, and within minutes the message became the heart of every conversation. Sarah Collins walked back inside Harper's Grill and instructed the staff to prepare fresh meals for every customer whose lunch had been interrupted. Today, she said, we remind people what hospitality really means. The employees immediately agreed. Outside, Captain Hayes informed Daniel that another officer would drive his patrol vehicle back to the station. Daniel removed a few personal belongings from the front seat before closing the door with unusual care. He had climbed into that vehicle hundreds of times without thinking about the responsibility it represented. Today it felt different. He glanced once more toward James, who was speaking with a little boy fascinated by the military pin on his cap. James knelt slightly so the child could see it more closely and explained that courage was not about proving someone else wrong. It was about choosing to do what was right even when nobody was watching. The boy smiled as though he had just learned something he would remember for the rest of his life. Daniel watched the moment in complete silence. He realized that the strongest person he had encountered all afternoon had never raised his voice, demanded attention, or sought revenge. Instead, James had answered disrespect with patience, misunderstanding with grace, and public humiliation with unwavering dignity. Standing there beneath the warm afternoon sun, surrounded by neighbors who had chosen compassion over conflict, Daniel began to understand that real authority was never measured by the power to make someone leave. It was measured by the wisdom to make every person feel they belonged. The parking lot gradually returned to its ordinary rhythm, yet the afternoon continued, leaving quiet impressions on everyone who had witnessed it. Families climbed into their cars, speaking more softly than before. Employees returned to Harper's Grill with renewed purpose, greeting each customer with genuine warmth as though every welcome now carried greater meaning. James Carter remained near the entrance for a few more minutes, patiently thanking each person who had chosen to stand beside him. Many apologized for what had happened, even though they had played no part in it. James answered every apology in the same gentle way. You showed up when it mattered. That is enough. Captain Robert Hayes watched those exchanges carefully, recognizing that trust within a community was built through moments exactly like these. Before leaving, he approached James one final time. Mr. Carter, he said, I cannot change what happened today, but I can promise you it will receive the attention it deserves. James extended his hand once again. That is all anyone should ask from a good leader, Captain. Not perfection. Accountability. Hayes nodded thoughtfully before returning to his patrol vehicle. Daniel Brooks remained standing nearby, waiting quietly for the ride back to the station. He looked toward James several times, each glance lingering a little longer than the last. Finally, he walked forward with measured steps and stopped a respectful distance away. For a moment, neither man spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was honest. Daniel finally broke it. Mr. Carter, I know that saying these words cannot erase what happened today. He paused, choosing each sentence with unusual care. But I was wrong to judge you before I knew you. I allowed assumptions to guide my actions instead of facts. I am sorry. The surrounding conversations faded almost completely as several nearby witnesses noticed the exchange. James studied Daniel's face for a long moment. He saw embarrassment there, but he also saw something that had not existed earlier that afternoon. Humility. Officer Brooks, James replied calmly. Real change begins the moment a person becomes willing to tell the truth about himself. I accept your apology, but accepting it also means believing you will learn from this day. Daniel slowly nodded. I intend to. James smiled with quiet sincerity. Then do not learn it only for me. Learn it for the next person you meet before you know their story. Those words settled deeply into Daniel's heart. They were neither punishment nor condemnation. They were a challenge to become better than he had been only hours before. Sarah Collins stepped outside carrying a neatly wrapped meal in a paper bag. Mr. Carter, she said warmly, our kitchen prepared your lunch again. This one is on the house. James looked surprised before smiling gratefully. You do not have to do that. Sarah gently shook her head. Today reminded us what kind of place we want this restaurant to be. James accepted the bag with quiet appreciation and thanked every employee by name as they gathered near the entrance. Several customers applauded softly, not for a victory over another person, but for the simple restoration of dignity. As James walked toward his pickup truck, the little girl who had watched everything from her father's arms earlier ran a few careful steps forward with permission from her parents. She handed James a folded napkin covered in colorful crayon stars and one handwritten sentence. He opened it slowly and read the words with moist eyes. "Thank you for being kind." He folded the note with the same care he had given his granddaughter's birthday card earlier that day and placed them together inside his wallet, knowing that sometimes the smallest reminders carried the greatest strength, and that the quiet courage of ordinary people could leave a legacy far greater than fear ever could. Several weeks passed before James Carter returned to Harper's Grill, and by then the memory of that afternoon had quietly spread far beyond the small town. The video recorded by witnesses had reached thousands of people, not because it contained shouting or dramatic confrontation, but because it revealed something far more powerful. It showed how ordinary citizens could choose dignity over silence. The official review conducted by the police department had been completed with transparency, and Captain Robert Hayes had personally met with community leaders, veterans, business owners, and local residents to strengthen trust through honest conversation rather than carefully prepared statements. Officer Daniel Brooks accepted the findings without excuses and entered additional community relations and professional development training. More importantly, he accepted responsibility for allowing assumptions to influence his judgment. For James, none of those developments became the center of his life. Every morning he still woke before sunrise, watered the flowers his late wife had once planted, called his granddaughter on weekends, and carried himself with the same quiet humility that had defined him long before anyone recognized his name. When he stepped through the front doors of Harper's Grill once again, the familiar bell above the entrance rang softly. Sarah Collins looked up from the front counter and smiled immediately. "Welcome back, Mr. Carter," she said warmly. Every employee greeted him by name. His favorite booth near the window had been prepared exactly as he remembered it, and resting on the table was a small folded card signed by every member of the staff. James opened it carefully. The message was simple. "Thank you for reminding us what respect looks like." He smiled gently before placing the card beside the birthday note from his granddaughter that still remained safely inside his wallet. As he sat down, customers recognized him but respected his privacy. A few veterans quietly nodded as they passed. A young family smiled from another booth. Nobody treated him like a celebrity. They treated him like a neighbor, which was all he had ever wanted. A few minutes later, the front door opened once more. Daniel Brooks entered wearing ordinary clothes instead of a police uniform. He paused near the entrance, noticed James by the window, and slowly walked over. "May I join you for a moment?" he asked respectfully. James looked up with the same calm expression he had carried from the beginning. "Of course." Daniel sat across from him and placed a cup of coffee on the table without speaking for several seconds. Finally, he said, "I have thought about that afternoon every day since it happened. I cannot change it, but I can choose the officer and the man I become because of it." James listened quietly before offering a small smile. The strongest people are not the ones who never make mistakes. They are the ones who allow the truth to change them. Daniel nodded, grateful for words that carried neither resentment nor superiority. They spoke for several more minutes, not as opponents, but as two men who understood that real justice was never about humiliating another person. It was about restoring what prejudice had tried to take away. Outside the restaurant, life continued as it always had. Cars passed along the street. Children laughed in the distance. The afternoon sun reflected softly across the windows of Harper's Grill. Nothing about the building appeared different, yet everyone who had lived through those events knew that one quiet afternoon had left something permanent behind. A badge may carry authority, and a uniform may command attention, but character is what earns respect. James had walked into the restaurant carrying only his dignity, and he walked away having reminded an entire community that the measure of a person is never found in assumptions, appearances, or power. It is found in the courage to see humanity before judgment. Because when truth quietly stands its ground, justice eventually finds its own voice.